I have how long?
5 minutes.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give you 10.
How about 9 minutes and 59 seconds?
That works.
Okay. Well, I think Steve wanted me to talk a little bit about the history of how all of this got started. And in order for me to explain how ACB got started, I have to kind of go into my story a little bit first, because my story, my personal story, is an integral part of how all this happened. I was not born into this organization. I'm one of those oddballs that got proselytized into it at the age of 17. I come from a religious family. My father was a Presbyterian minister. He was a graduate of Princeton Seminary, had a divinity degree, had one of the largest Presbyterian congregations in the city of Philadelphia. So I was raised, in a very religious atmosphere. And when I was a teenager, I started a small business after school and got involved in a partnership with a fellow who had a wife who was one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And she would talk to me about the Bible this and the Bible that, and of course, my being from a religious background, well, we had a lot to talk about. And she asked me if I would be interested in sitting on a Bible study that she was having on a weekly basis with her husband. Her husband was not a baptized witness, and one of the elders from the congregation would come over and study with her husband every week. And she said, "Would you like to sit in on this?" And well, what harm could it possibly do? It's a Bible study, right?
You took the bait.
I took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. So the elder who studied with me, this guy was a master salesman. I mean, he was really good. He had me convinced. Now you have to understand, I started studying in September of 1974. And he had me convinced that Armageddon was coming in about a year, in 1975, okay? And two things happened while I was studying with this elder. Number one was I really wanted to save my skin, okay? I did not want to die in Armageddon, because he's talking about, how all the corpses are going to be lying around and the birds are going to be pecking your eyes out and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't want to be a part of that, okay? And the other thing was, coming from a family whose father was a minister and having a religious background, and I was being told that my job, once I became a baptized witness, would be to go from door to door trying to find other people to save. I felt that I was being handed a sacred trust. I really believed that. I thought that I was being given a special gift by God to go and save other people. And I became very enthusiastic about it. And one thing I have to mention, though, is during this period, the elder came to a knowledge of my sexuality. And he told me, he says, "Look," he says, "all you have to do is stop being gay for a few months, and then Armageddon comes and you survive, and it doesn't matter anymore." So I figured, a few months of celibacy in exchange for immortality, it sounds like a fair deal to me. So, I just, I never really stopped being gay. I just stopped having sex, okay? And, thought that would, if I stay celibate, well, the whole gay thought process will disappear from me once I'm living on the other side in perfection, because I thought that my being gay was an imperfection, because even before I ever started studying with this elder, I knew all about those scriptures in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians and in Romans chapter 1 and all of that place that I understand now are mistranslations, but at the time I really believed that they were condemnations of homosexuality. And I believed that God hated me for who I was. So I, with great enthusiasm, delved into the witnesses, was baptized on the 4th of July in 1975, and lo and behold, Armageddon never came. So what do you do now? Well, you keep on being a witness, you know. And eventually they came out with this really strange theory about why Armageddon didn't come. In fact, I heard that theory at a district convention here in Atlanta. There was a district overseer who was speaking, and he said that the reason why Armageddon didn't come was that because that September, I think it was 1975 date, was the 6,000th year of the creation of Adam, but Armageddon wouldn't come until the 6,000th year of the creation of Eve. Okay? And since there's no mention in the Bible as to how long it was before God took Adam's ribs and created Eve, and his exact words were, "We're out on uncharted waters."
Wow.
Okay? And of course, I fell for it hook, line, and sinker again. You know, went back to being a faithful witness because I was getting kind of disgruntled at this point. I had been treated pretty badly. I became a witness living in Pennsylvania. And the first couple of years were okay. Then it became a struggle. My sexuality came back with full force. I had a affair with a Bible study, and yes, but because I was repentant, I was only given private reproof for it. Of course, that killed me being on the fast track to any kind of ministerial servant position. And then a couple of months later, I decided to go out with friends to the theater to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And when the elders found out that I had gone to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show, they thought that I had damaged the reputation of the congregation, even though there was no mention of my being a witness. They thought that this was so damaging to the congregation that they didn't wait until Thursday night, when they usually make the announcements of reproof and disfellowshipping. They announced that I was being administered public reproof between the Sunday talk and the Watchtower study. Yeah. Because I had somehow besmirched the congregation's good name. And anyway, I left Pennsylvania, moved here to Atlanta. This is back in late 70s somewhere. And when the elders here found out about the fact that I had been given public reproof for going to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show, they thought this was the stupidest thing they ever heard in their lives, and they immediately lifted my reproof. So I spent 9 months living here in Atlanta. And after leaving Atlanta, I moved to the Virgin Islands and spent all of about 13 years living there. But upon my arrival, the elders in the congregation, as is their procedure, wrote to the congregation in Atlanta for my records. And when the records were sent down, they discovered that I had been given public reproof in Pennsylvania, and they decided that the congregation in Atlanta lifting the public reproof wasn't good enough for them. They wanted to contact the congregation back in Pennsylvania, who wrote a nastygram back to them and said that the Atlanta congregation had no right to lift my public reproof and demanded that it be reinstated immediately, and that's exactly what they did. Yeah. Well, by this time I was absolutely disgusted with the way I was being treated. I was basically being used as a pawn in a power struggle between three congregations. And my sexuality, my raging hormones were raging. I mean, I'm in my early 20s at the time, you know. But back in the 70s, there's no real way of gracefully leaving the organization like there is today. Back then, writing a letter of disassociation was virtually unheard of. So how do you leave when there's no real graceful way to leave? You go out and deliberately do something to get yourself disfellowshipped. And in my case, I decided I'm going to start smoking. So what happens is, one of the elders comes into my place of business, and I light up a cigarette and I blow smoke in his face.
obvious, was it, Jim?
No, not too obvious at all. So interestingly, I was called before a judicial committee. Surprise, surprise. Well, that's exactly what I wanted. The funny part is, though, that when I went before that judicial committee, not one word was mentioned about my smoking. Everything was sex. And they didn't want generalities, they wanted details. You know, okay? And you've heard stories about elders who get off on listening to the details and stuff like that. Well, I got proof. I got proof that the elders get off on listening to the details, because I think it was about 3 days after I was disfellowshipped, one of those elders on my judicial committee came to my door at my home and tried to seduce me. Yeah. Fortunately, a worldly friend, worldly, I love that word, came to my door at the time when the elder excused himself and never came back to my house again. But, he throws me out. And his final words to me before I left the Kingdom Hall, before he showed up a few days later, he says, "God no longer loves you, not because of what you do, but because of who you are." You know? So I walked away from the Kingdom Hall believing this. You know, I'd always been religious in nature, and I believed, well, if God no longer loves me, I'm going to go out partying. And my alcohol and drug abuse increased exponentially from that point. I went out and partied. There was a gay bar on St. Thomas that I used to frequent on virtually nightly basis. And, you know, I basically became, I guess what you would call a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, they said that, you know, when you get disfellowshipped, you become promiscuous, and you know, you lead this really miserable, disgusting life. And you know, so I decided, okay, well, you know, this is what they're telling me I'm going to become. I might as well become it. But of course, I'm living on this little tiny island that's 13 miles long and 3 miles wide, and there ain't a hell of a big gay community there. So what do? You know, and I'm certainly the only person on the whole island who was ever disfellowshipped for being gay. You know. Although I should have been disfellowshipped for smoking, but that's another story entirely. So I went to this local little bookstore to look for anything gay, because you know, coming out on a small island is very different from coming out in a major metropolis like, you know, Atlanta or New York or something like that, where you've got this big gay community that's just already right there, and you've got plenty of resources and stuff like that. You live on a little island, you look for any resource you can. And I found this magazine called The Advocate. Okay, so I buy the copy of The Advocate, and I'm leafing through The Advocate. In the very back of the magazine, there are these classifieds. And one of the classifieds was for another little magazine called RFD, which stands for Radical Fairy Digest. Okay. And RFD, it said at the time, was a magazine for rural gay people. Well, I figured to live on a small island in the Caribbean, that qualifies as rural. So I sent for the magazine. And I got the magazine in the mail a couple of weeks later. And of course, this is long before the internet existed. We're talking 1980 here, okay? And they had a classified section too. So I decided I'm going to advertise in this magazine and see if there are any other gay ex-Jehovah's Witnesses out there. I figured I couldn't possibly be the only one, even though, you know, 1980, you know, there's no support group out there for us. There are no support groups for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses of any kind back then that I knew of, okay? So I figure, well, I might as well put an ad in there and see if there's anybody else out there. Well, I got about a half a dozen letters in the mail. The first one I got was from a guy in Brooklyn, New York, who was a former Bethelite. Then I got one from a fellow in Indianapolis, and the only other, I remember there was one in Arizona, one in California, and I remember there was one from South America, from I think Ecuador. And I was like, wow, you know, I'm not the only one. So I wrote back to these guys. I says, should I start a newsletter? So they thought this was a really great idea, and that way we could all hook up with one another and just, correspond and talk about, our experiences as witnesses and being gay and stuff like that. And so I started, it was, I had this old 1930s typewriter, and I'd type the thing out by hand, and then I'd go down to the local library, and for, I guess it was a nickel a copy or something like that, I'd make Xerox copies on the public Xerox copier in the library and mail it out to these guys. Well, of course, a half a dozen people, that's not a lot. All right. Of course, it wasn't, in 1980, it was a lot of people. But I left the Virgin Islands for a short period of time in 81 and went up to Chicago and spent, I guess it was about 6 months there. Well, during the time that I lived in Chicago, I befriended a fellow who was kind of he was a mentor and a father figure to me. A very, very dear friend of mine for many years. He passed away a few years ago. His name was George Busey. And George, while he was never a witness himself, now we had a lot of very interesting things in common. He was a Presbyterian minister like my father. He was also gay, and his grandmother was a Bible student who knew Charles Taze Russell personally, okay? And she was constantly trying to press him into joining the religion. Of course, she had long since been passed away, but he had a certain fascination with Jehovah's Witnesses because of his grandmother's involvement with, before they were called witnesses, they were called the Bible students, and that's what she was. George, among his many other talents, also wrote for the Chicago Gay Press, for the Windy City Times and for Gay Chicago, and decided that he was going to write an article about this support group for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, for gay and lesbian ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and ended up getting a half a page of space in, do you remember which magazine it was, Alan? Was it the Windy City Times? Anyway, when we had our conference here in Chicago, in Chicago a few years back, 5 years ago, Alan and I went to the, what's the name of the library? The Gay and Lesbian Archive Library there. Yeah. Yeah. Gerber, yeah. Anyway, Alan and I went there, and we were going through all these newspapers, these gay and lesbian newspapers from back in the 80s, from back in the early 80s, to see if we could find this article, and Alan found it. So if anybody is interested in reading a copy of real early ACB history, I have copies at home. Just give me your address and I'll be more than happy to mail them to you. I tried scanning it and putting it online, but the print's so small it just doesn't scan properly. But if you want copies, I'll be more than happy to mail them to you. It's a really fascinating read. And at the end of the article, it gave my post office box address in the Virgin Islands. And through this, I was able to find more people who were gay and lesbian ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. And then, I guess, one of the people at the Advocate saw that there was this group for gay and lesbian ex-Jehovah's Witnesses starting, and they decided to run a little blurb about it and put my address in the Advocate, which is, this magazine that goes all over the country. And that gave us a huge kickstart. And by this time I had, I guess, maybe about 30 people, that I was in contact with. This is way back in the early days, long before the internet. And, so here I am typing away and, sending out these newsletters and stuff like that. Well, unfortunately, living in the Caribbean, where alcohol flows very freely, and the fact that I'm a recovering alcoholic now, but I was an active alcoholic back then, the witnesses told me God doesn't like me anymore. I might as well drink myself to death and have fun partying, right? So, that newsletter took backseat to my drinking career. And along come these two lesbians who live out in California, who decided a little bit after me to start another support group for gay and lesbian. Now their group was a little bit different because the one was a lesbian. I mean, they were both lesbians. They were partners. One was an ex-witness, and the other one was an ex-Mormon. So I don't remember their names, but they decided to start a combination group for ex-witnesses and ex-Mormons. And then along comes this guy in Pittsburgh, PA, named Dan Rested, who got the same idea and decided to start a group on the East Coast. Well, I couldn't keep up with, the newsletters and stuff like that, and I wrote to these people. I wrote to the women out on the West Coast, and I wrote to Dan, and I says, would you guys be interested in my mailing list and, taking over what I've been doing? And I, gave the mailing list to them, and the group continued. Well, I don't know whatever happened with the women out on the West Coast. Their group just fizzled after a while, apparently. I don't know whether they gave their mailing list to Dan or not, but Dan kept it going for a long time. And during that period of time, Dan came up with the name Common Bond. Up until then, we were just the support group for gay and lesbian ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a really long name. And they decided they wanted something shorter, and Dan came up with Common Bond. Well, the years passed, and eventually the internet started. And in the early days of the internet, there was a straight ex-Jehovah's Witness who lived in Norway, who still lives in Norway, named Kent Steinhag. And Kent decided he was going to do a page on his website, which was at the time called the Watchtower Observer, for gay and lesbian ex-witnesses. And myself and John Wertman, who I think some of you know, we were the first two people to contact him, so he put our stories on his website. And John lived not too far from me, and we used to meet regularly at his apartment. We had a couple of other guys coming over, and we had this California Common Bond chapter going. And we thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we started our own website? So we started our own website and got into a lot of trouble with Mother Watchtower because of it, because there was this one picture that I took out of the Watchtower magazine it was supposed to depict the resurrection, and it had this man hugging another man and this woman hugging another woman, and I thought, God, that looks like homoeroticism if I ever saw it. So I put it on our page, and we got this real nasty letter from the Watchtower's legal department saying we were in violation of their copyright, which in theory maybe we were, but because of fair use and we weren't making any money off of it, I mean, we would have, had we decided to pursue it legally, we would have won. But they were slick. They didn't come after us. They came after the company that owned the web hosting company, and they went after them, and they didn't want to get involved in a legal battle, and they shut us down. So I decided to take the site overseas, and I hired another company over in England, which didn't have those laws at the time, and put up and got our own domain, which is still in use today, gayxjw.org. And that's now hosted by Ulysses in Philadelphia. In any event, during this period of time, Kent, our straight friend in Norway, decided he was going to start a correspondence group for us. And he started it on this little list called OneList. Some of you have been around since I know Steve's been around since the OneList day. I think you're like one of the charter members,
Steve's been around for a long time.
Yeah, for a long time. Well, anyway, OneList got eventually bought out by somebody else, and during this period of time, the people that were on the group in the early days, I think Jesse, you were on for a long, long time too, decided, we need a name for this group. So I wrote to Dan Rested, and I says to Dan, is it okay if we use the name Common Bond? And he gave us his blessing, and that's how we became Common Bond. That's how we became ACB. I still have the letter at home from Dan, giving us his blessing to use the Common Bond name. So, that is how we got started, and this year was the 30th anniversary for Common Bond, you know, and you're all a part of it. This is all of you guys. I'm not nearly as involved in it as I once was. I was the webmaster of the website for a lot of years, but I couldn't keep it up, so I turned it over to Ulysses. He's having trouble now keeping it up because of his job constraints. He's traveling all over the world. He's over in Europe right now, I believe, which is why he couldn't come to the conference. So we are looking for somebody who would be willing to take over the website and keep it updated on a regular basis, because it hasn't been updated in some time. So whoever, if any of you are interested, or if any of you know of somebody who's interested, you know, we need an active/interactive website so that.
Remember the Kingdom Melody song, Here I Am, Send Me.
Oh, shut up.
That's the wrong way to sing it.
I think I've gone over my 9 minutes and 59 seconds.
We're all hungry.
Yes, I know you're all hungry. Do we have time for Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that pretty much covers the history. You know, we're at the 30-year mark, and yeah, absolutely. You know, somebody asked me when at the conference in Chicago, you know, something to the effect of, you know, how does it feel being the person who started all this ball rolling? And the only answer that I can give, if you've ever seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption, you know, I to quote the Tim Robbins character, I was in the path of the tornado. You know, it just happened that everything fell into place for me to get this thing started. If it hadn't been me, it would have been somebody else. It was an idea whose time had come. You know, Scott.
How do you know Randy Waters? He said he knows you.
Randy and I have been corresponding for many, many years. I know Randy through Kent. Randy's known Kent for longer than he's known me. And Kent is the one that put us in touch many, many, many years ago. Well, you know, in the early internet days. Yeah. Great guy, Randy.
I assume he's a really religious guy, right?
Yeah, he is.
When I first found his side, I just assumed that he would be pretty homophobic, and he's not.
He's a born-again Christian, but he's very open-minded with gay people.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
Well, I had to say that I wish I had found that site years earlier. It would have helped me probably come out quicker. But I do have to say that somehow I've been getting emails from people that I don't know. And they say, well, we saw your name on something or other. I said, where did you see my name at? But there's still a lot of folks out there that are still practicing witnesses that are gay, and they're telling me their life story, and I'm trying to encourage them or what have you. But it's got to be a helpful thing.
You know, that's something I want to mention, too. Over the years, I've corresponded personally with somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 gay witnesses and ex-witnesses around the world, in some pretty, you know, remote places, too. I mean, Fiji, American Samoa. I've got one in Kenya that I write to on a regular basis who's a transgender ex-witness. The Philippines, sure. You know, all over the world.
Could you guesstimate, or are there numbers of how many members with the online site are?
You know,
I'm just
it's
curious.
it really varies.
200, but there's only about 20 or 30 who are actually active.
You know, and you'd have to ask Scott, because he's in touch with a lot of ones that we're not in touch with, you know, through his blog.
Which is sort of how I ended up here, because I'm trying to find a place to send them.
Yeah, exactly.
The ones that I get are the ones who are saying I'm suicidal, or, you know.
Right, and the problem is that we're getting, you know, we have a very inactive website now, and we need to get that site back up and running on an active basis. You know, we really need somebody to take it over, and in a hurry, because there's a lot of need out there. Larry?
Being one of the moderators on the Yahoo group, I tell you, there are, even though there's not a whole lot of activity that really has been going on for about the last 6 months, trust me, the board members are on top of it. The second thing I'll tell you is, you'll be amazed if you really see what I see, what we see, actually, the moderators that are on the list. There, every stinking day, there are people that join our group.
Mhm.
and they remain ghosts on there.
Yeah, that's what I was
And
gonna
actually, I'll
say.
tell you, I go out of my way as much as I can, and I interface with every one of them. I write them personally, I tell them a little bit about who I am, you know, what part I play in the group, and I'm like, please step up to the plate, talk, just
Mhm.
introduce yourselves. If
Mhm.
not, if you have questions, if you need to talk to somebody, you wanna talk to somebody in your area, I'll go find them for you.
Right. And Facebook, I'm getting the same thing on Facebook.
No, there's more than that, actually.
Yeah.
There's really, I would say right now, current to date, there's probably about 430-ish that are actually assigned to the group.
But just
And-
not active and
But
They're just
can I-
ghosts.
ghosts, yeah.
Can
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right place to do this or not, but when I look at the conversations that go on in the Yahoo group, that would have scared the shit out of me when I was first coming in.
I agree to a certain
Yes,
point.
yes.
I'm
We keep
not gonna
trying to
send
tell
people
Larry
like
that.
there. The people that are writing to me, I'm not gonna send them there.
Yeah.
That group either needs, if it wants to be there to help the people who are trying to find their way on Kingdom Hall, it's gotta clean up the.
You know, and Ulysses,
I'll with you real quick, okay? Besides my kid.
Isn't there another group though?
yeah, well, Ulysses tried setting up the message board on the Gay XJW website, and it just, and people for some reason just don't really, they don't like the way the message board is set up, and they're staying away from it.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it is, it is, the threads and everything, yeah.
You guys want to go offline and take this at lunch?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up and have lunch,
Yeah.
and then we can talk.
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, I wanted to touch on one thing before I close, and that is the fact that, you know, we need to find a way to reach out to the gay witnesses and the gay ex-witnesses who have become self-loathing, self-fulfilling prophecies like I was when I first came out of the organization, okay? Some of the most vicious correspondence that I have received have been from gay ex-witnesses. I've actually received 3 death threats over the years. Now, those came from active witnesses, all right? Yeah, seriously. But I find that the obstacles that they that they run into are either they don't want to cut off contact with their family. That's number one.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the biggie. And the other one is that they're so indoctrinated by the Watchtower's teachings that they do believe that even though they're gay, and there's nothing they can do about the fact that they're gay, that they are going to die at Armageddon.
Absolutely.
And they believe that it's the truth. And for me to come across and say, well, blah, 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 they think that I'm insulting their religion, even though in a lot of cases they've been disfellowshipped themselves. The other thing is that, how should I put this? The people that there's also an undercurrent of gay active witnesses. They call themselves, I don't know if any of you have heard of these guys or not, they're called BHFs. BHF stands for Brothers with Homosexual Feelings. Okay, and they have their own support group.
We have one like that up in.
Yeah.
Cartersville.
Yeah, and-
I'm trying to avoid him as much as possible.
Yeah, and
I actually found the website, it's a British.
yeah, it's a British website. Yeah, I've been on it many times. I do too. I write to him a lot, and he's a really nice guy. But
Yeah,
he's
he's
just,
very nice, but-
they absolutely believe in staying witnesses and abstaining. But they're talking about how cute this guy is and how much they love hanging around with this brother,
Or
and
they
it's
have
just like
little parties and try and seduce young
Yeah,
girls.
yeah, exactly.
Well, we
So.
need to wrap this up so we can get to
Anyway.
lunch, and then we want to thank